Luke's Trek, Book 5 of the America Falls series, written by Scott Medbury, narrated by Adam Barr. All characters and events depicted in this work are fictitious. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. So I will deliver you from the hand of the wicked, and I will redeem you from the grasp of the violent. Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 21. Prologue. The big man's face was gaunt, the leather he wore covered in dust. Even so, he was an impressive sight. He stood just over 6'3", with matted, unruly red hair and broad shoulders. The worn soles of his boots made no sound on the road as he approached the faded billboard. Willetton Green, Pop 323, the happiest little community in Maine. Lots still available. Some comic genius had scratched a minus symbol in front of the 323. For good measure, they had etched a crude penis near the lips of the smiling mother watching over her kids in the staged family portrait. The kids, a boy and a girl, played in a sand pit, while in the background, Dad cooked on the barbecue. He stopped and pondered the sign, scratching his stubbled chin with the back of the hook where his left hand used to be. He didn't smile. The picture was meant to be inviting. Now, it was just sad. He dismissed it and scanned the walled subdivision it was promoting. The surprisingly intact red brick walls stood about 8 feet high, the open entrance just 30 feet away. Bent and twisted wrought iron gates lay in the long grass either side of the road. Maybe the suburb was abandoned? Maybe not. He wasn't sure if the feeling of being watched was from the dogs behind him or the town ahead. It didn't matter too much. He turned around. The dogs were the imminent threat. Anything else he would deal with when it arose. There they were in the distance, milling around in the shadow of the trees he had passed a few minutes before. He thought they might be coyotes or some dog-coyote hybrid. Whatever they were, they looked lean and mean. They had followed him for 2 days at a safe distance, but over the last few hours had steadily closed the gap. His vision swam, and he swayed a little as he was hit with a bout of lightheadedness. His mind threw up a memory of another pack, equally as mean, he had encountered a long time ago. His vision cleared, and he came back to the present. The big man had only had water in the last 36 hours. His last meal, a skinny rabbit he'd cooked over a small fire the afternoon before last. He knew the dogs sensed him weakening and would have to be dealt with before long. He decided it was better now, on his terms, rather than later, on theirs. "Guess who's on the menu, you mongrels?" he grated in his long, unused voice. He'd never eaten dog, but thought he was about at the point where he just might be ready to try. He reached into the waistband of the leather motorcycle pants he wore and pulled out the pistol he was carrying. It was a Glock 17. He had picked it up a few days before while foraging for food in an abandoned house. There it had been, just sitting on the table with 2 clips of ammo. He couldn't have been more surprised if it had been wrapped in a pretty pink ribbon. He didn't question how it had come to be there. It didn't matter. Didn't matter any more than the lone can of whole tomatoes he had found in the otherwise stripped pantry in the same kitchen. He had wolfed down the tomatoes and left with the newly acquired weapon in his belt. One didn't question Providence. He paused a moment and glanced back at the entrance to the housing development. Perhaps it was best to save the Glock and its precious ammunition in case of predators of the 2-legged variety. He put the gun back in his belt and started slowly towards the pack. As if sensing their long chase was coming to a climax, the dogs ceased their milling. He counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, no, 5. perhaps more that he couldn't see. As he closed the distance, the biggest dog padded from the cover of the trees, and his packmates followed him. Make that 6. The man's pace didn't change, but when they were roughly 30 feet away from each other, the leader of the pack stopped in his tracks as if weighing the threat of this two-legged adversary/meal. The man thought again of that other encounter with wild dogs in the first few weeks after America fell. It hadn't ended well for one of the children he'd been with. They'd all been children then. Not anymore. Unhurriedly, he reached over his shoulder and gripped the handle of the axe clasped in a leather strap across his back and pulled it free. He balanced its haft on the back of his hook and adjusted his grip so that it was a third of the way up the handle. Still walking, he hefted it and watched as the dogs began moving again. They were smart. 2 had loped on ahead of the leader and were now flanking him on either side while the others fanned out beside the leader. Perhaps it had been a mistake to put the gun away. Too late now. "Come and get me," he snarled and charged at the leader. The 2 dogs flanking him immediately rushed in, but his unexpected offensive had given him a few valuable seconds alone with the boss dog. The leader jumped, its jaws opened wide. He misjudged its speed slightly and had to swing the axe defensively, the flat of the iron head striking at a glancing blow on the shoulder. The dog yelped and tumbled onto the road as a second dog, the first of the flankers, leapt at him. It wasn't so lucky. The axe cleaved its skull, killing it instantly. He brought the axe up again, but was hit hard in the side by the other flanker. He dropped to one knee as it began to chow down on the wrist of his axe-wielding hand. Growling, but perhaps more cautious after his knock on the shoulder, the leader and the remaining dogs closed in slowly. Still wrestling, the big animal mauling his arm, the man found his feet and, with a quick slashing movement, embedded his hook in the side of the dog's neck. Its yelp of surprise and pain was cut short as he jerked his arm back, opening its throat with a scarlet-red flourish. The man straightened unsteadily and raised his axe. He fixed his stare on the leader who stood, teeth bared, less than 5 feet away, a dog either side of him. "Come on, you fucker." Concerned with the threat in front of him, he only remembered the other dogs when he saw a flash of gray in his peripheral vision. He managed to raise the axe, but the speed and weight of another dog knocked him to the ground, cracking his head hard against the asphalt of the old road. The axe slipped from his grip and clattered out of his reach. Stinking hot forms swarmed over him. Teeth and claws began to rip into his motorcycle leathers. As the strength seeped from his body, he relaxed and looked up at a perfect blue sky, framed by bristling, heaving bodies. "I'm coming, Brooke," he whispered. Part 1. Exit. Stage left. 1. 1 month earlier.
"Luke, we need to try and save—"
Luke didn't hear anything over the drumming of his own heartbeat. Brooke was dead. His baby, too, snuffed out like candles and leaving him in a cocoon of suffocating pain. Barely able to see through the tears in his eyes, he trudged down the hallway, the walls and floor closing in on him like a tunnel before he pushed through the door at the end. His steps were unhurried but inexorable, and carried him down the flight of fire stairs to the lobby of the hotel they had made their temporary home. Around 50 of their people sat or lounged on the floor in the lobby, and many of them stood up expectantly as Luke entered. "What's the news? Is Indigo okay?" Luke was heedless of those around him, and strode across the marble floor and through the broken doors without looking back. "Where's he going?" someone asked, as some of them moved to the plate glass windows to watch him. He didn't look back. He walked on, his back straight and arms swinging mechanically, as he turned the corner and disappeared from their view. Luke didn't pause as he came to the barricade. He pushed aside a shopping cart full of rocks and continued up the 4-lane street where the love of his life had been mortally wounded. The Marauder army was gone. The tank in the middle of the road and the body of their leader lying in the street were the only sign they had ever been there. Like a robot that had received a pause command, he came to a standstill, looking at the distant body. He turned as if he had forgotten something and headed back to the edge of the barricade at the same inexorable pace. Pulling away a soil-filled barrel and letting it crash to the pavement, he found what he was looking for. A jerry can set aside for purposes of dousing the barricade and setting it alight to try and slow the Marauders when they attacked. He picked it up and pocketed the lighter that had been left on top and turned back to the road. It was only when he was within 50 feet of the body that he realized that Ash's body had not been left unattended. A shaven-haired boy of about 6 or 7 lay across the body. As Luke approached, the kid raised his head. His light blue eyes unmistakably marked him as Ash's child. There were no tears on the kid's face, and no fear in his eyes.
"You killed my dad,"
he said simply, as Luke's shadow loomed over him. Luke put the jerry can down on the road. "Yes." No need to sugarcoat. The kid had obviously seen everything. "Why didn't you go with your people?"
"They told me to fuck off and rot with my dad. Are you going to kill me now?"
The foul word from his young lips shocked Luke more than his question. "No, I'm not going to kill you."
"Why?"
he asked, his face puzzled. "Because there's been enough death today, and you aren't to blame for what your father did." He chewed on that for a while.
"My dad would have killed everybody. I've seen him do it before."
"I know. He had a sickness in his head." The kid stood up.
"Can I go with you?"
Again, Luke was taken aback. Was it that obvious that he was leaving? His face remained stony. "No."
"You should kill me then,"
he said, voicing words no child should ever have to utter.
"I've got nowhere to go."
"They were wrong to leave you. None of it's your fault. But I can't take you with me. Come over here." The boy walked around his father's corpse and approached Luke, a tinge of fear finally touching his pale blue eyes. Luke put his arm over the kid's shoulder. The boy's eyes widened at the blood-stained hook hovering inches from his face, and turned him towards the barricade at the end of the street. "What's your name, kid?"
"Cade."
"Cade," Luke said. "I want you to go past the barricade and head to the big building to the right. When you get there, ask to see Indigo. Tell her Luke sent you." The boy opened his mouth, but Luke had already released him and given him a gentle shove between the shoulder blades. The boy looked back once, but kept going when Luke nodded. He waited until the kid had passed the barricade and disappeared around the corner before turning back to the body of Brooks' killer. He pondered briefly about the possibility of evil being passed on in the genes. He had read something once about a genetic disposition to psychopathy, a gene discovered that was shared by a high percentage of serial killers and linked to an increased risk of violent or aggressive behavior. Hopefully Ash had been a product of his circumstances, and the kid, young enough to forget his. He picked up the jerry can and uncapped it. Luke didn't linger to watch the bastard burn. The crackle and reek of his burning flesh proved no salve for the wound his soul had suffered. He walked. 2. He didn't have any idea where he was walking. He just knew he couldn't stay. The anger and loss he felt were all-consuming. The rage wasn't limited to Ash either. He was furious at himself for not acting sooner or forcing Isaac to let him fight. He was even more furious at Isaac for making his stupid deal instead of going into battle in the first place. The raw anger he felt clouded the reasoning part of his mind that would have told him it was just as likely Brooke would have intervened if he'd been the one to battle Ash. Or worse, died anyway if they'd gone into battle against the Marauders. He walked for an hour and then pushed on for another 20 minutes after the sunset before deciding to find shelter. He headed off the arterial road he had been following and down a side street into an outer satellite suburb of Manchester. It looked like it had been a fairly well-to-do neighborhood in its time. The houses were big, and he spotted a few nice cars gone to rust and ruin in their overgrown driveways. He turned down a cul-de-sac called Endeavor Close and stopped at number 5. 5 was the street number of his home back in Rhode Island, and the one before that, too. "Do you think our next place will be number 5, too?" his mother used to ask when he was young enough to still be interested in small coincidences. Number 5 Endeavor Street was a double-story home, brick on bottom, white cladding on top. The lawn was no longer a lawn, just tall, tangled grass lapping at his waist as he headed to the front porch. He tried the brass knob. Locked. A quick flick of his hook smashed the decorative glass inside of the door, and he reached in with his good hand and unlatched the door before easing it open. Dark clouds shrouded the crescent moon, but the filtered light still allowed him to see a few feet inside the entrance. Further on, it was dark. Really dark. And in the cold light of, well, pitch black, he cursed his lack of foresight. No flashlight, no gun, no weapon at all besides his Swiss Army knife. He strained his eyes and could just make out the shape of a small side table in the murk. He went to it as quietly as he could, not contemplating how silly that was. After all, if there were any remaining inhabitants, they would be no more than desiccated husks by now. He pulled open the drawer of the side table and was about to reach in blindly when he heard a creak from the ceiling overhead. His hand froze, while his heartbeat sped up to a light gallop. He didn't move for a few seconds, a darker shadow in the dark hallway, and then shook his head in disgust. Idiot, scared of a creaky old house. He changed his mind about exploring the drawer in the dark, and instead pulled it right out and carried it to the front door. He placed it on the stoop and began to rummage through its contents. It's what his mom would have called a man drawer. He found an assortment of remote controls, batteries, none in their packaging, coins, bobby pins, rubber bands, old light bulbs, a razor blade, and a small tube of superglue. Disappointed, he pocketed the glue and the rubber bands and, as an afterthought, the coins. The rest was junk, even more useless now than it was when its owners were alive. He was about to toss the drawer into the garden when he saw a sliver of something wedged between the base of the drawer and the back corner. A match. He carefully plucked it out and raised it into the night sky as if he had pulled Excalibur from its stone. Now he might have some light and warmth. He would only have one shot, though. He'd have to be careful. He put the wooden end of the stick between his teeth and emptied the contents of the drawer into the garden before heading back into the house. In the tepid moonlight, he was able to make out an opening opposite the side table. A living room, maybe? And hopefully one with a fireplace. He used his hook to hold the drawer against his side, and with his free hand began to feel his way slowly along the hallway wall until he reached the opening. He went through. No moonlight shone through the windows in this room, which were shuttered from the outside, and he literally could not see his hand in front of his face. He decided to go left and feel his way around the wall. He'd only gone a few feet when his knees bumped into something soft. Warily, he bent over and reached out to touch a soft, velvety material. It was a sofa or armchair. He found the arm and then ran his fingers down the side to the seat cushion. fearing all the while he would touch the skeletal thigh of a long-dead inhabitant. He knew it wasn't likely, but a gruesome discovery was always a possibility. There was no body, and his hand glided across the seat unhindered until he found a crack and then another seat cushion. It was a sofa. He was tempted to sit for just a minute, but knew it would be so much sweeter in the light of a warm fire. He moved on. After the 3-seater sofa, he came to a coffee table, then an armchair made from the same material as the sofa, and then a closed door, before his hands finally found the much-anticipated mantelpiece. Still blind, he ran his good hand under the lip of the mantel, down to the brickwork. When he thought he was far enough along, he reached down until he found the opening and dropped to his knees, placing the drawer next to him before reaching blindly for the hearth. His fingers found the wire mesh of a lightweight fire guard. He pulled it out of the way and then found the remains of the last fire. He was able to discern at least 2 logs. Charcoal crumbled under his touch, but towards the ends he found unburned timber. Ever the optimist, he decided to build a pyre before looking for something like kindling or paper to complement the lone match. He raised the drawer and smashed it on the bricks. In minutes, he had assembled what felt like a decent little pyre of splintered timber in and around the unburned portion of the 2 small logs. If he got it going, the shards of drawer would burn quickly. Hopefully the logs would take. Once he had light, he would be able to find plenty of fuel for the fire by wrecking more furniture. He sat back on his haunches for a second. Now he just needed paper. Luke rose to his feet and made his way back along the wall until he came to the coffee table again. He knelt and reached underneath, his hands finding a shelf. He groped blindly, hoping to find a long-forgotten magazine or newspaper, but instead his fingers encountered a web. He yelped, nearly losing the match in his teeth, and snatched his hand away, wiping it on his jeans in disgust. He hated spiders, and right now, in the darkened old house, he imagined there was a big sucker just waiting for him to put his hand back in. He heard another creak from the floor above and shivered. Nope, nothing for it. He pulled the match from his teeth and put it in his jacket pocket. "Come on, you pussy," he grated. "It's just a web." Taking a deep breath, he reached in again and swiftly moved his hand along the shelf from side to side before grabbing the first item his fingers found. A book. From its size and weight, a thick paperback. Yes! It was a shame to burn a book, but there was no way he was reaching into that dark recess again when the book would provide perfectly good fuel. Back at the fireplace, he began to rip pages out of the book, crumpling them into balls and placing them strategically in and under the timber pyre he had put together. When he was satisfied, he pulled the match out of his pocket and gingerly pinched it between his thumb and index finger as he located the closest ball of paper with the back of his hand. He struck the match on the brickwork of the floor of the hearth. Nothing. Come on. He struck again. A spark. On the third strike, it burst into a bright but weak flame, and he quickly held it against the crumpled page. It caught immediately. Shadows began to dance in celebration on the walls of the cozy living room. Sighing with relief, he pushed the ball a little further under the broken timber of the old drawer with his hook. The fire consumed the paper quickly without the wood catching, and he quickly shoved another of the crumpled pages next to it. Finally, the slenderest of the shards took, and he quickly ripped more pages out, pushing them under the flaming kindling. The smoke was thick and gray, the varnish on the timber of the broken drawer burning with a faint chemical smell. Now able to see by the light of the fire, Luke's eyes fell upon a basketful of evenly cut logs, barely a foot to the right of the mantelpiece. Next to it on the floor was a low stack of neatly folded newspapers and a big old axe, its haft resting against the wall. Luke shook his head and smiled wryly. Oh well, better late than never. He put 2 of the cut logs on the fire and watched the flames lick and dance over them for a few minutes. He'd always found fire hypnotic, and remembered one of his mother's favorite things had been to sit out on their balcony around the fire pit on cool fall nights. He felt a trickle of loss, but did not allow himself to think about what had happened earlier that day, lest the trickle become a flood that would sweep him away. He picked up the annihilated paperback and turned it over. The Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. A collection of short stories by the master of horror, just what he needed in a dark, abandoned home. "No thanks, Stevie boy," he said aloud. "Love your work, but not tonight." He tossed it aside and stood up, looking around the room. It was a typical American living room, TV in the corner, a bigger coffee table in the center of the room, fireplace, sofas, Christmas decorations still hanging from the walls. He walked across to the wall beside the TV and looked at the framed pictures on the wall. From what he could tell, it had been owned by a handsome, silver-haired couple in their 60s. Their portrait was in the center, and around them, like satellites around a sun, were assorted children and grandchildren. Luke felt a sense of sadness wash over him. "I'll have to tell Brooke." Then it hit him. Brooke was gone. He had forgotten in the moment and fell to his knees as the grief washed over him afresh. The groan of anguish that escaped his lips was almost animalistic and faded into sobs as he lay down on the carpet and tucked his knees into his chest. 3. When Luke awoke, it was still dark and the fire had died down to embers. He sat up. His head was heavy and his eyes dry. He crawled to the hearth. Within a few minutes he had the fire blazing again and adjourned to the sofa, his head on a cushion, with his feet hanging over the armrest at the other end. It was no use. He couldn't sleep now. His mind headed straight back to the confrontation earlier that day, and replayed it over and over, trying to work out how he could have prevented the awful event that followed. He blamed himself, blamed Isaac, even blamed Brooke. "Why couldn't you have just stayed behind the barricade?" He cried. He raged. He cried some more. Finally, after an hour, he got up from the sofa, drained, and went to the doors by the fireplace, pushing them open. The glow of the flames revealed a hallway with stairs leading to the second floor to the right and a neat kitchen to the left. Luke propped the door open with an armchair and went through to the kitchen. He was surprised to find the pantry full, a treasure trove of canned food. He wasn't hungry, though. He was thirsty, and there, right in front of him, was a shrink-wrapped 6-pack of Evian water. Even better, right behind the water was a 6-pack of Budweiser. Luke pushed aside the water and grabbed the beer before heading back into the living room. 4.5 beers and a lot of tears later, Luke heard the creaking upstairs again. Imbued with a healthy dose of Dutch courage, he looked up at the ceiling and scratched his chin. "We should investigate, Captain," he said in his best Mr. Spock voice. He stood up a little too quickly and steadied himself before heading to the door. He froze on the cusp, performed a drunken U-turn, and headed back to the fireplace. "Aha. Come here, my friend. I may need your assistance." He picked up the axe he found earlier and hefted it before heading back towards the hallway. The cloudy night had obviously cleared. There was more moonlight coming from the floor above now. He could make out the stairs clearly. "Set phasers to stun, Spock. I'm going in." "Yes, Captain." He climbed the steps 2 at a time and reached an open landing that the previous owners had used as a study, the light from the double-sized window revealing a desk, long-dead computer, and a small sofa. As he passed, Luke ran his hand affectionately over the computer monitor and then entered the upstairs hallway. When he reached the first door on the right, He did his best Bruce Lee and kicked it open so hard it bounced off the wall and slammed back into him as he went through, nearly knocking him over. "Ouch, smooth move, Captain," said Spock. A bed, a dresser, a wardrobe, nothing else. He walked back into the hall and whistled nonchalantly as he sidled up to the next door. No use trying to be stealthy now. This time he tucked the axe under his arm and turned the doorknob, letting the door creak open before gripping his axe and charging in with a roar. Another empty room. But as his yell faded, he heard a faint scrabbling coming from the hallway, as if he'd awoken something, or someone. With his heart beating hard, he headed into the hall again. 10 feet along, to the left, was another door. This one open. "You might want to come out now," he called. "I'm armed, and we don't want any accidents, do we?" The only reply from within the room was a bump and a scrape, and he slowly crept towards the open door, axe raised and hook at the ready. "Okay, we'll do it the hard way." He rushed the door and skidded to a halt as a long, low shape dashed towards him, then pulled up with a loud hiss followed by a menacing mewling sound. A freaking cat. It was easy to make out its shape in the dimness. No ordinary cat, though. It was at least twice the size of any house cat he'd ever seen, and it was in full attack mode, its body sideways, back arched and spitting venomously. Luke took an involuntary step back when it darted another few steps forward, as if daring him to attack. Luke relaxed and held up his axe in surrender. "Easy, big guy. I'll let you be." That was when he heard a mewling from the shadows behind the angry feline. He looked at her dangling underbelly and put 2 and 2 together. No offense meant by the big guy crack. You're clearly all woman. I'll leave you and your babies to it." The mama cat didn't stand down as he slowly backtracked into the hallway. He heard her threatening mewling all the way to the bottom of the stairs. More comfortable knowing who his mysterious roomie was, Luke headed back down and into the kitchen. He decided he'd had enough beer and grabbed a bottle of water from the 6-pack he set aside earlier. He drank the whole bottle before heading outside to relieve himself. Back in the living room, he made sure to close the door to the hallway and stoked the fire before laying down on the sofa. He was asleep within seconds. 4. Luke awoke the next morning with a fuzzy head. He downed another bottle of water for breakfast. It wasn't bad, considering it was about 6 years past its expiry. Lacking energy, he lay back down, and his mind turned to what he would do next. In the end, he did nothing. He had zero motivation. He was unable to think of anything for more than a few seconds before the events of the day before swamped him. The grief didn't abate. It sucked the strength from him, and he found all he could do was lay on the sofa, drifting in and out of fitful sleep. He had no idea what time it was when he finally roused himself from the sofa again, but he was starving. He made a quick trip into the jungle-like backyard and took a leak, before heading back in and treating himself to a can of tiny potatoes, washed down with the last can of beer. He was crying again as he swallowed the last few bites and slammed his hand down on the table in frustration. Grief, it appeared, came in waves, and it seemed the only way to escape it completely was to sleep. Wishing he had more beer, he dragged himself to the sofa and collapsed in a heap. Sleep took him eventually, and he dreamed of Brooke. She was walking down a steep set of steps carved into a mountain. He followed, always behind and never able to catch her. He called and called, but she never turned around. "Brooke!" His eyes snapped open, awoken by the sound of his own desperate yell. Loss swept over him anew. On the 3rd morning in the abandoned home, he woke up feeling a little better. Sunlight was streaming through the glass of the front door, and he was hungry again. He fixed himself a cold breakfast of beans and franks and, as he ate, came up with a plan of action. He couldn't stay there any longer and had no interest in heading back to the others in the city center. In fact, he wondered if he ever would. When he took his dirty plate back to the kitchen, he spotted a faded postcard stuck to the fridge door by a magnet. "Greetings from Portland, Maine," it said in happy yellow letters over a beach. The coast. He remembered visiting Portland with his grandparents as a kid and loving it. It seemed as good a place as any to head for. Why not? It would be a long, long walk, but what else did he have to do with his life for now? Decided, he went into the living room and pulled the drapes open. The family in the picture smiled down upon him, and he gave them a thumb up. "Thanks for having me, folks, but it's time I got moving." They didn't look the sort to have guns, so he didn't bother looking. He decided he would keep the axe just in case of feral humans. The only problem was, he didn't want to carry it. He went through the kitchen and opened the connecting door to the garage. It was a big garage, big enough for 2 cars, but only contained one under a canvas cover. The rest of the man cave was perfectly ordered, shelves full of gleaming, well-ordered tools. Luke decided his first job would be to fashion a holster of some sort that he could use to carry his new weapon on his back. Number 2 would be to find a sack or backpack of some sort. He planned to raid the kitchen before he left. An hour later, he had fashioned a crude over-the-shoulder holster from a tool belt he had found in the garage workshop. He'd removed the pouch and all but one of the larger leather loops and had to stretch the circlet, probably designed to hold a hammer, carefully until it could accommodate the thickness of the axe handle. When he was satisfied, he put the belt over his right shoulder, looped it under the opposite arm, and then turned it until the circlet was up near his shoulder blade. He slid the axe handle into the leather circlet and allowed it to slide down until it caught the head. Pulling it out by the head wasn't ideal. It would have been much better handle first, but there was no way he could fashion anything like a clip to hold the axe upside down in a short period of time. He practiced pulling it free by the axe head until his muscles were sore, getting quicker with each attempt. Next, he graduated to 2 moves, the initial pulling the axe free, then a release, allowing it to fly into the air before grabbing it by the handle with the same hand as it fell. He dropped it the first 3 times, caught it on the 4th attempt, dropped it on the 5th, caught it, caught it, caught it. He drilled for an hour, and while he wasn't quite satisfied, knew he could get more practice as he went. He didn't find a backpack, but settled for a small Hessian sack he found under the sink in the kitchen. From the pantry, he placed as many cans as he thought he would feel comfortable carrying, along with the last of the water. He finished his cache with a steak knife, can opener, and a salt shaker. After filling the sack, Luke went back to the garage to collect his axe and pulled open the roller door. Sunlight flooded the space, and he suddenly wondered what vehicle was under the cover. He thought he could spare a minute to look. Whatever it was looked low and mean. He bent down and grasped the corner of the cover and slowly pulled it up to reveal the grill. Holy shit. Luke ripped the cover back and over the car to reveal a gleaming black '69 Mustang. He knew the car on sight. It had been his dad's obsession. His dad saying, "When I get my '69 Mustang," was the trigger of many good-natured ribbings from his mom. "Sure, honey. As soon as the mortgage is paid off, you can start saving for it." Luke smiled and ran his hand down the masculine lines of the muscle car as he reminisced. It was a peach, in perfect condition, the black paintwork flawless and the chrome gleaming. He tried the door. Locked. Maybe there were keys in the kitchen? He knew it wouldn't start, but suddenly he had the urge to sit in the car. He headed back inside and scoured the kitchen for the keys. He'd seen most of the house and was pretty sure the former owners had left in another vehicle. They certainly hadn't died in the house. That meant the keys should be here somewhere. It was nowhere to be found, and he headed back out to the garage almost ready to give up when he saw a plastic organizer on the wall beside the door. He didn't dare to hope as he rummaged through the pockets, pulling out pens and old bills before finding the Mustang keys in the bottom pocket. Luke rushed to the driver's door and slotted the key home, popping the lock and pulling the door open reverently before starting to climb in. He was brought to an abrupt halt when his axe caught the top of the door opening. "Jeez, idiot." A few seconds later, he was sitting behind the steering wheel sans axe. The interior smelled of leather and very faintly of gasoline. He breathed the scent deep. He spent a minute or two running his hand over the wheel and running the automatic transmission through its gears. He imagined hammering that sleek mother through the abandoned streets. There was no way he could get out of the Mustang without at least trying the ignition. He picked the keys up from the passenger seat where he had dropped them and slipped it into the slot beside the wheel. "Come on," he whispered, and turned the key forward. Nothing. Not even a click. Oh well. A little disappointed but not surprised, he climbed out. He took the time to pull the cover back over the car. He couldn't bear to leave it exposed. Besides, who knew? One day he might be back. He was about to head out when he spied a tall metal closet on the opposite wall. He decided to have a quick peek. It didn't have any locks, so there was a low chance of finding a firearm, but one never knew what other treats might be on offer. It was empty but for two hangers upon which hung black motorcycle leathers. Jacket and pants. They were well worn but looked heavy-duty. On the floor of the cupboard was a helmet. Leathers and helmet. No motorcycle. As he ran his fingers down the sleeve of the jacket, Luke reenacted the conversation that in his imagination might have led to such an outcome.
"It's me or the bike, George. You're too old for these shenanigans,"
he said in his best old lady voice. "I'll give it up on one condition, Ethel, one condition only. You let me buy a Mustang." Luke smirked at his own wit and stripped off quickly, replacing his jeans with the leather pants and throwing aside his denim jacket for the tough leather one with padded sleeves and shoulders. The jacket fitted nicely. The pants, too, apart from the legs being about 1.5 inches too short. "Ankle freezers," he said, looking at one foot, then the other. He wasn't sold on the pants, so he decided to keep his jeans for the time being. He folded them and put them in a supply sack. Once he'd pulled his scuffed old army boots back on, he didn't notice the short length of the leathers so much. He put the holster back over his shoulder and slotted the axe before picking up his sack and heading through the garage opening. He pulled the panel door closed and walked down the driveway without looking back. And that's how he walked out of Manchester, too, without looking back. He thought as he walked. Grief was a strange thing. He could function perfectly well for a while, but as soon as something triggered him to think about Brooke or the baby he'd never known, he would find himself crying again. Not tears of anger. That seemed to have passed. Just tears of loss. He had almost forgotten the pain he'd experienced at his parents' passing, but that, coming as it did with the end of the world, had been diffused. More a state of shock than solely grief. This was different, much rawer, more primal. The moments when his brain forgot she was gone didn't help. He remembered his grandmother talking about her grief when his granddad had died. Coming home from a trip to the supermarket the week after he'd passed, she'd seen his car in the driveway. She felt happy he was home from work so early, only to have her loss crash down on her again as she came off autopilot and remembered. It's like my brain is playing a cruel trick. The more logical part of Luke's mind told him it was probably a coping mechanism. The brain allowing one to function on a basic level without shutting down entirely. It didn't make things any easier, though. 5. Hours after Luke closed the garage door and set off on his trek, Isaac entered the room of the hotel suite he and Indigo had settled in. Indigo looked at him, her face hopeful but changing quickly. He looked bone-tired, and the set of his shoulders meant her next question was moot.
"Any sign?"
she asked. He shook his head and walked over to where she was gently rocking Luke and Brooke's baby girl in her arms. He leaned over and kissed Indigo's cheek, then looked down at the baby. She was sleeping soundly, her skin a healthy pink. It had been left to Ben to name the child, and he had chosen his mother's name, Erin. Isaac thought Brooke would have approved.
"How is she?"
"Good. The perfect baby."
"Where's Max?"
"With Allie and Ava."
"They took all of the kids down to play in the garden."
He looked at her.
"You told them about not leaving?"
"Yes," she said, exasperation creeping into her voice. "Stop worrying so much. Cade is not his father. He's just a kid." Isaac knew she was right, but he couldn't help being suspicious of Ash's son. Only God knew what he had seen and been through at the hands of his father. It had to have an effect, surely. And those eyes. He had those damn pale eyes. Indigo squeezed his hand.
"I've told them never to leave him alone with the other kids and to tell me if he says anything strange or acts out. To be honest, though, he's been nothing but well-behaved since he came through the door."
Isaac nodded and went to the small kitchenette and poured himself a water from the pitcher on the cupboard.
"Tell me about today,"
Indigo said. Isaac explained that they had searched the final zone to the west of the city. It was the 4th day since he'd walked out and they'd found no sign of Luke.
"That's it now,"
he said, sitting down and burying his head in his hands.
"We can't spend any more time looking for him."
Indigo stood up and gently placed Erin in the middle of their bed and went over and put a hand on Isaac's shoulder.
"It's okay. It's not your fault he left."
"Well, it's my fault Brooke is dead." His voice cracked.
"If I hadn't—" "Don't you dare, Isaac Race. There is only one person to blame, and it's not you. You were only doing what you thought was right. Luke will realize that eventually."
He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his wrist.
"I miss the fucker."
He laughed, trying to cover his embarrassment.
"We all do,"
Indigo said, taking him in her arms as she stood up.
"He'll be back." "I'm not so sure."
She didn't argue with him. What was the point?
"What are we up to with the move to the Brady Sullivan building?" she asked, changing the subject. "Bo and his crews have cleaned out the ground floor plus the 1st and 2nd, so we have enough room for everyone to begin moving in. Once we're in there, we can start making it livable floor by floor." "Exciting. Have you thought about where we'll have our room?"
"No," he laughed. "You want the penthouse, don't you?" She shrugged.
"As long as I'm with you and Max, I'd be happy in the basement or the underground car park."
They kissed.
"We'll get started packing our things at dawn." "Well, I better head down and pass Erin to Ben," said Indigo. "It's time to go and help the girls get started on dinner." "Okay, I'll go find Max and have a play date with Uncle Ben," he said impishly. "You do that."
As devastating and raw as Brooke's death was, life would go on, and right then, Indigo's sadness was tinged with optimism for the future. 6. Luke made his way north from Manchester on the 93. The most direct route would have been to head straight for the coast along the 101, but that would have meant turning back and heading into central Manchester. He didn't want to risk the possibility of running into Isaac and co., who, no doubt, would have tried to talk him out of going. He wasn't ready for that. Wasn't ready to speak to anybody. He needed space, needed to clear his mind of the ghosts of Brooke and their baby. He knew if he headed north to Concord he could take another road to the coast, then hook up with the 95. That would take him up the East Coast through Portsmouth into Maine. From Portsmouth, he guessed it would be about 50 miles to Portland. Walking on the 93 was quick and easy, and by the time he stopped to eat a can of beans around noon, he estimated he only had another 2 to 3 hours walking before he reached Concord. Concord was the site of their small victory over the Chinese occupiers. It was a good memory, and he smiled as his boots chewed up the yards. It had been the first time they felt they'd actually struck a blow against the invaders on a scale that meant anything. As much as the memory gave him a warm buzz, he didn't plan to enter the city. Common sense told him if there was danger, it would be more likely to come in the old city centers than on the road. No, he would skirt the city to the east and hook up with the 393, which would take him out to the coast. He was looking forward to seeing the ocean. It had been a long, long time. Luke had always found the highways and turnpikes the most haunting remnants of the before days. An empty house was different. After all, how many times was a home empty even with the largest and busiest of families? Highways, though, well, they were never empty. They were the arteries of the old world. To see them now, their edges overgrown, rusting cars scattered sporadically and the occasional upended tree over the outer lanes, made him feel melancholy. 2.5 hours after stopping for lunch, he closed in on Concord. "Hello, old friend." Luke's voice grated at the Merrimack as its winding course met the road he was walking upon. To his left, Concord looked much as he remembered it from his first visit, just a little more overgrown along the outskirts. But something about the picture was jarring, and it took him a few seconds to realize what it was. Smoke. Chimney smoke. He counted at least 3 whitish plumes rising into the clear mid-afternoon sky. Concord was a ghost town no more. He was curious as to who had settled there, especially since the Marauders had been terrorizing the region for a good couple of years. He decided it must be a large and well-defended group. He decided it was best not to tempt fate and to get off the roadway and hug the riverbank until he could cross the Merrimack. He could then take the back roads past the old airport. While there were a few residential suburbs on that side, he doubted the settlers had spread their roots that far. He had barely taken 5 steps off the road when he heard the screech of tires and roar of an engine from the direction he had been heading. It was a green army jeep. "Great," he muttered. No use running. They had seen him, and he counted 4 heads in the vehicle speeding towards him. A foot chase would end badly. He stood his ground. He'd done nothing and was just passing through. Hopefully these survivors were of the talk first rather than shoot first variety. He put his sack of supplies on the cracked tarmac and stood with his hands by his side, waiting calmly for their arrival. The jeep slowed as it approached, and Luke, who could now see the occupants more clearly, raised an eyebrow. They were wearing army fatigues. The driver pulled up about 30 feet away, and they piled out and trained their weapons on him. "Arms above your head!" yelled one of them. Luke looked at them, his eyes wide in surprise. Aside from the first one to jump out, the men that confronted him were old. Old enough for him to know they had been grown men and not kids when the Pyongyang flu had devastated the country. To a man, they all looked early to mid-30s. Not only that, while their fatigues were faded and worn, the men were well-groomed with identical short back and sides haircuts. "I said, put your arms up!" Snapping out of it, he raised his arms and regarded the leader. "Just passing through, soldier," said Luke, and found himself hit with another surprise. "I know you." "Frisk him," said the leader. Luke stood passively as 2 men holstered their firearms and approached him warily. The young guy eyed his hook nervously as they patted him down. Then the penny dropped. "How's Colonel Randall?" Luke asked, conversationally. The hands of the men patting him down froze, and he was rewarded with an inquisitive glare from the leader. "How do you know that name?" he asked. I'm hurt you don't remember me, Bowman. Has it been that long? Bowman squinted, and Luke saw recognition dawn in his eyes. Luke? Jesus, no, I did not. He came forward as the other men finished their pat-down. Luke held out his hand, and Bowman grasped it, looking up at him. Holy hell, you were a scrawny little kid up to my chin last time I saw you. Yep, he said. Glad to see you made it out of Drake Mountain. We saw the Chinese begin their attack as we were hightailing it out of there. To be honest, I thought you guys were toast. Up close, Luke could see the faint lines around Bowman's eyes. He looked a lot harder than the fresh-faced recruit he had been just 6 years before. I thought we were toast, too. Colonel Randall managed to get us out of there, though. Long story. What happened to your hand? Rag. We got him, though, he said, unable to keep a little pride out of his voice. Bowman nodded. We never saw that bastard again. I thought he'd done a runner. Look, where are you headed? You should come and talk to the colonel. We can share intel. This encounter had changed things for Luke. He was still heading to the coast, but his natural curiosity meant this was an opportunity too good to pass up. It would be good to know what had happened at Drake Mountain after they'd left. Are you inviting me for dinner and a sleepover? Bowman grinned. Still a smartass, I see. Sure, a sleepover, why not? Come on. Luke picked up his sack and they walked over to the Jeep. Feeling as upbeat as he had in days, he quickly shut down the direction his mind was heading. Saracen, Bowman addressed the young soldier whose face Luke didn't remember from Drake Mountain. I'll get you to walk back to town. We'll let our guest have a seat in the Jeep. Yes, sir. Thanks, said Luke, reaching over his shoulder, pulling the axe out of its loop by the blade and fluidly flipping it in the air before catching it by the handle. Bowman nodded appreciatively. Nice trick. Yeah, getting there. You want me to put it in back? Yes, and your pack if you want. 7. On the short drive to the city center, Luke took in as much as he could. Apart from the lack of cars, the section of Main Street that the Drake Mountain guys had occupied could have passed for any town pre-attack. It was neat and well-ordered, and then Luke spotted something that made his mouth drop open. Light in some of the shop windows, but not the flickering light of candles or a fireplace. Electric light. You guys have power? Yep, and some water, said Bowman. Wow, that's amazing. Good old Army know-how, huh? Yep, the colonel runs a pretty tight ship. Luke spotted clothes hanging in the window of what, according to the old signage, used to be Betty Lou's Emporium. And stores? Bowman waved vaguely at the shop fronts. Kind of. Clothes and food shops, but no one pays for anything. If they're pulling their weight, no one goes hungry. It's all free, but rationed. Communist paradise, huh? Bowman bristled, and Luke immediately regretted using the term. No offense. I mean in the purest sense of the word. I mean the community owns everything and everybody contributes to receive what they need. Bowman relaxed. Yeah, the professor came up with a system and it seems to work pretty well. The color drained from Luke's face. Oh, the professor, said Bowman. Don't worry about him. Things aren't the way they used to be. Well, actually, I'll leave it for the colonel to tell you about it. How many of you are there? Luke asked. About 500. We managed to evacuate some of the kids when we got out of there, but there were a lot left behind. We're about half Drake Mountain survivors and half people we've assimilated since. So they live in the houses, right? I saw chimney smoke. Yeah, when we first got here, we bunked down in an old school, but as we rebuilt, we started repopulating the town. Bowman turned off the main street onto Green Street. The colonel and us grunts used the old city hall as our base. Oh, I thought you'd be in the State House, said Luke. No, the Chinese used that as their base and pretty much gutted it. Here we are. They pulled up in front of a pretty, triple-story red brick building surrounded by neat, manicured lawns, with white arched windows and an impressive spire atop it. It was a jarring sight for Luke, considering the vacant and overgrown post-apocalyptic landscape he was used to traveling through. Luke could see now how he had been spotted. He could see at least 2 figures in the shadows of the viewing area under the peaked iron cap of the spire. They got out of the vehicle and headed into the building. Up close, the facade of the building was even more impressive and harkened back to an earlier time. Once they stepped through the entrance, though, its decor was 90s council office. Luke received curious stares from the few uniformed occupants of the building that they encountered as Bowman took him up 2 flights of stairs to the colonel's quarters on the top floor. There was a pretty, dark-haired girl around his age at a desk outside grand double doors. She looked confident, and her gaze locked onto Luke's briefly before dismissing him and passing to his escort without so much as a raised eyebrow. "Lieutenant Bowman?" she said, all business. "Hi, Becky. I need to see the colonel. We have a visitor he'd be interested in talking to." "I see. One moment." She stood up and went to the door. She wore a crisp black skirt and white shirt, with patent leather shoes that looked like they had seen better days. She knocked lightly before opening the door. "Bowman has someone to see you, sir." She looked over her shoulder at Luke, her eyes curious, then back into the office. "Not sure, sir. Definitely not one of ours."
"Send them in,"
came the response. Luke recognized Colonel Randall's gruff voice immediately. "Yes, sir." Becky returned to her desk. "The colonel will see you now." Am I in a time warp? Luke asked himself, unable to shake the feeling he was watching actors in a TV show. He tipped an imaginary hat at Becky and was rewarded with a brief curl of a smile before she found something more interesting in the papers on her desk. Luke followed Bowman into the colonel's office. Colonel Randall regarded the big leather-clad man that entered his office with a steely look.
"And this is—"
he asked, without breaking Luke's gaze.
"It's Luke, sir, from Drake Mountain. He's changed a bit."
The older man's eyes widened.
"Isaac's friend?"
he queried Luke, as if not quite believing his own man. Luke grinned.
"Yep, that's me." "Well, I never thought I'd see you boys again. Not after the professor sent his attack dog after you."
He stood up from his chair, limped around the table, and held his hand out to Luke. Luke took it, and they shook hands warmly.
"War wound?"
Randall asked, gesturing to his hook.
"Yeah, looks like you have one too."
Randall patted his thigh.
"Yes, bullet just above the knee."
His eyes grew distant.
"Not a Chinese bullet either. Have a seat. Looks like we have some catching up to do. Bowman, bring us some coffee, will you?"
"Sir." Bowman exited, and Luke took a seat as Randall made his way back behind the desk.
"I'm afraid of the answer, but is Isaac still alive? The rest of your group?"
Randall saw the kid's mouth tighten. He might be as big as a linebacker, but Randall couldn't think of him as anything but a kid.
"Isaac was alive and well last time I saw him. We lost some escaping Drake Mountain and some since, but on the whole, yeah, most are still alive."
The old man nodded. Some tragedy had befallen the kid, and he wasn't about to rip the scab off his wound by asking for more details.
"And Rag?"
Luke dragged his hook across his throat.
"Good. How?" "He caught us on the mountain pass. We managed to kill him in the end, but not before he killed Toby and did some damage to Isaac."
Randall nodded.
"He was a formidable prick. You did well to stop him. How did you lose your hand?" "I can thank Rag for that, too. He shattered the bones in my hand during the escape. We had to take it off." "I see. Where did you head after you escaped?" "We headed south and managed to find ourselves a place to live, a farm. We were there just on 5 years before we were forced to move on a few months ago."
Luke didn't want to expand on that story with the colonel. That conversation would only lead to the tragic confrontation with the Marauders. What about you? How did it go down?
Your escape was the catalyst for a final confrontation, actually. The professor was injured and went crazy. Well, crazier. And he ordered the Homeland Security to lock my men up. I couldn't have that, of course, and it turned to violence. I was shot, but we won, which is why you're talking to me now and not him, I guess. After the smoke cleared, we carried him out of there. I'm glad we brought him along. He's been a valuable contributor here in Concord.
Luke doubted the wisdom of giving the professor a second chance, but held his tongue. How did you get out? He asked. Randall shrugged.
There was an escape tunnel known only to the top brass. When we saw the enemy incoming, we got the hell out of there. Not quick enough to save everybody. They hit the facility with missiles, and it wasn't as impregnable as we'd been led to believe. We lost a hell of a lot of people, but we managed to evacuate nearly half the military personnel who'd survived the battle with Homeland, plus about 100 kids.
So the tunnel you had us digging really was just a ruse to keep us busy? You had another escape route the whole time? There was a knock at the door.
It was. Come.
Bowman brought in a tray with 2 mugs of steaming black liquid.
I can't believe you have coffee, Luke asked, sniffing the delicious aroma. It's instant, Randall said. We found a few pallets of it in a Costco. Should be enough to see out my days at least. Tastes like tar, but beggars can't be choosers.
Luke took a sip.
Best coffee I've tasted in years, he said.
Mind you, it is the only coffee I've had in years. Randall and Bowman laughed. The younger man took his leave.
Now, said Randall, where were we?
The tunnel.
Ah, yes, you're right. The tunnel was to keep the kids busy. All the other work, too. Idle hands of the devil's workshop and all. Can you imagine being cooped up in that hole in the ground with nothing to do?
No, I guess it was the smart thing to do.
So anyway, we hightailed it out of there. It was tough going, though. The escape tunnel led out in thick woods, and we had to take a path directly east to get out of there and avoid the Chinese. They came in hot.
I know. It's why I was so surprised when Bowman and his boys pulled up in front of me this afternoon. We didn't think anyone could make it out. How did you end up here?
Well, we went nomad for a while, until it was clear that the professor's virus had worked and the Chinese had been forced to retreat west. After 2 months living hand-to-mouth, we picked Concord as the site of our resurrection. It was close and big enough to house us plus more. It also had the bonus of being a former Chinese base, so we were able to fit out our little army properly. It stands over 200 strong now, and we have close to 500 souls all up. So you said you were at this farmhouse for 5 years. Why did you leave?
Cornered, Luke told the story of the attack by the Marauders and the subsequent pursuit to Manchester, without naming the city. While he trusted Colonel Randall, Isaac and the rest would be licking their wounds for a while, and wouldn't want attention from an armed force so close to home when they hadn't even settled in properly. There would be plenty of time later to put out feelers to their neighbors. He was sure it would benefit both settlements if they could develop a good working relationship. Randall didn't pursue it, perhaps sensing Luke was wanting to keep his cards close to his chest.
Marauders, huh? Don't know the name, but were they based up north? A big group led by a tattooed freak?
Yep, that's them.
They were in Ashland. Okay, yep. We were keeping our eye on them. We only had one skirmish near our roadblocks on the 93 south of Plymouth. It didn't end well for them, probably why they avoided us. We avoided them, too.
Luke nodded and waited for the obvious question. Almost as if reading his mind, it was the next one from Randall's lips.
So why are you traveling alone?
I couldn't, he began, and his voice cracked with emotion. He felt his mouth drag involuntarily at the corners as he struggled to contain his emotions in front of the older man. I lost someone. Sorry. The colonel stood up and came around to Luke, and put his arm around the younger man's broad shoulders. Nothing to be sorry about, son," he said in a low voice. The man's empathy opened the floodgates, and Luke was suddenly racked with sobs that, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't control. He buried his face in Randall's side, helpless not to take comfort in the small act of human kindness. They were like that for a long time, until Luke's sobs abated. He pulled away. "Sorry," he murmured, wiping tears from his eyes sheepishly. "You may need to have that uniform dry cleaned." Randall laughed heartily. "As I said, no apology necessary. Sometimes you just need to get it out, especially if you haven't had someone to talk to." Luke nodded. The colonel went back to his desk and looked out the window as he sat down, wincing at the stiffness in his leg. "Looks like it's nearly time for grub. Will you join us?" "Yes, thanks. That would be great. Any chance of a bed for the night?" "Of course. Goes without saying. After dinner, I'll have Bowman allocate you a cot in the sleeping quarters. You're welcome to stay longer if you wish." "Thanks for the offer, but I'll get going tomorrow." "Where are you heading?" "East. I want to see the ocean again." "Sounds like a grand plan, son. East is good." "West isn't? Chinese?" "Not until you cross the Mississippi. That's their border now. So we hear, anyway. Since they fled the professor's virus, they haven't been back across. That doesn't mean they won't in the future. But I'm thinking the Western Canada is plenty big enough to keep them busy. No, there's a colony that's sprung up in New York State, Rochester. Apparently they call themselves New America. They're aggressive and they're spreading, swallowing up any smaller groups they come across. Rumor is that Aiden Riley is their leader." Luke recognized the name instantly. "The president's son?" "The very same. It's a rumor only at this stage, but one I hope to get confirmation of real soon. I have a 4-man team going out in 2 days to gather intel." "Why now?" "Because sooner or later, we're going to run across them. We've taken in some people who crossed 3 states to get away from them. Apparently their M.O. is to give anyone they come across an ultimatum. Join and become loyal citizens of New America, what they call allies, or be wiped out." "Like the Romans?" Luke said. "Yeah, just like the Romans. My team will give me an idea of how big they are and how far west they've come." Luke started to rethink his decision to stay mum about Manchester. Isaac should know about this. But the threat wasn't imminent, so he stayed his tongue. All up, they spoke for 2 hours before Randall stood up. "Okay, then. Well, I'll show you around some, then we'll eat," said Randall. 8. The evening meal was surreal. Word had spread about the big, red-haired man with the hook for a hand, a long-lost survivor of Drake Mountain. Rushed plans were made, and nearly half the community turned out at the city hall for a feast in his honor. The crowd was too big to fit inside, so given it was an unseasonably warm night, tables were set up on the lawn. Luke, the colonel, Bowman, and some other soldiers of an equivalent rank were seated at the head table. He had barely sat down before a wooden goblet of frothy beer was thrust into his hand. Randall, holding a goblet of his own, stood, and the crowd hushed. "Folks, tonight we celebrate the appearance of a friend from Drake Mountain. We thought he and his people were lost. Raise your drinks in a toast to old friends and to those we've lost along the way. To Luke." Randall banged his goblet against Luke's, and they both took a long draught. The warm, home-brewed draught had a strong, nutty flavor to it, but was pleasant enough, and after half a goblet, went straight to his head. Not only warm with alcohol, he leaned back and watched the happy people of Concord getting on with life. The meal was a sight to behold. Fresh vegetables, fruit, and meat. Luke began to salivate as they were carving meat from the huge slab of beef on the spit. He hadn't eaten a proper cooked meal since they had fled the farm, and even then, Generally chicken or rabbit was usually the meat they consumed. Luke ate with relish. In fact, he ate so much that his bloated stomach was protruding over the waistband of his pants when he was done. He was just washing down the final mouthful with the dregs of his second beer drink when he saw a painfully thin man with white hair and a scraggly beard making his way through the throng and towards their table. Professor Leahy was very different in appearance to the last time Luke had seen him, but his right hand, palsied and pink with scar tissue from the bullet that had pierced his hand during their escape, was the giveaway. Luke was unprepared for pure anger, long checked, that he felt at the sight of the professor. Triggered, memories of the murder of Sonny came flooding back. He put the goblet down, picked up the sharp knife, greasy with the fat of the beef he had just eaten, and began to rise. Two things happened. One, the professor smiled at Luke, his lively eyes belying his decrepit appearance, and approached. Two, Randall gripped Luke's wrist and leaned in to whisper in his ear, "Easy, son. He's paid for his crimes." Luke ignored the colonel and tried to shake his hand off. He found himself suddenly intent on murder. "Luke," Randall whispered harshly, "drop the knife. I can't let you touch the professor." In his current state of mind, death was no great disincentive for Luke, and he bared his teeth in frustration as the colonel's iron grip tightened on his wrist. Eventually, he was forced to drop the knife onto the table. Possibly unaware of the danger he was in, the professor stopped directly in front of Luke. "Greetings, honored guest," he said, without an ounce of recognition in his eyes, and bowed theatrically before flitting away towards the beef spit, mumbling to himself. It was only then that Luke noticed the deep indentation to the top of his left head. His anger slowly receded. Randall relaxed his grip, but didn't let go. "That's what I mean by punished. He's not all there. But you know what? His working mind is still a thing of beauty. You wouldn't believe how many times he has come up with an idea to save our asses. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have running water or power. Hell, we've even got a mini oil refinery." "What happened?" Luke asked. "One of the girls he'd had in his damned breeding program smashed a rock over his head during our escape. It's a miracle he survived. One that I'm thankful for." Luke was satisfied. The professor had received his punishment after all, and he was no longer the same man who had ordered Sonny killed 5 years before. As classic a case of karma biting one in the ass as he'd ever seen. "Fair enough." Randall, satisfied that Luke's violent urge had passed, released his wrist. "These people would have strung you up from the nearest tree if you'd harmed a hair on his head, by the way," said Bowman, draining his second goblet of beer and grinning. "How about another beer, then?" "Why not?" said Luke, gulping the last of his goblet and handing it over. After Luke's third beer, someone broke out a fiddle and began playing. A whoop went up, and suddenly people were out of their seats, moving tables and forming into lines. Well and truly in the mood to party, Luke found himself on his feet and being dragged towards the makeshift dance floor by the very lovely Becky, Colonel Randall's raven-haired secretary. She had appeared out of nowhere. Her dark hair had been let out, and she wore a pair of jeans with a flattering pink sweater. Even in his tipsy state he noted the admiring glances of some of the men around him. Luke was no Fred Astaire, but he was a passable dancer, and with his inhibitions lowered by the homebrew, joined in with gusto, ever mindful of his hook as people swirled around him. Becky seemed to find her way back to him within a few rotations, and it was perhaps clear to some of the people around, except perhaps Luke, that she had her eye on him. After a half hour of dancing, Luke put up his hands in surrender. He was exhausted. Becky stood on tiptoes and put her hand to his ear. "I'm beat," she said, her warm breath tickling his ear. "Want to go get some fresh air?" "I thought you'd never ask," said Luke. "Lead the way." Luke followed her as she weaved her way through the throng of dancers, gently rebuffing calls for her to dance some more. "Ah, that's better," he said, concentrating on walking a straight line. "Haven't had a workout like that in a while." Becky giggled and reached out to grasp his hand. Her hand was warm and soft, and now, even tipsy and exhausted, Luke couldn't fail to see that it wasn't just fresh air she was interested in. "We can sit over there," said Becky. He allowed her to pull him over to a wooden bench in the green space behind the council building. Luke let go of her hand as they sat down unsteadily, their shoulders touching. Ever the gentleman, he shuffled away to make some room. She surprised him again by shuffling close enough for their arms to touch. "You're a great dancer for a big guy," she said with a grin. "Thanks," he said sheepishly. "You too. Well, not for a big guy. You're just good." She laughed and grabbed his hand. "You're so cute," she said to a blushing Luke. "Can I see your hook?" Luke shrugged. He was sobering quickly and struggling to find a way out of this sticky situation he was in without hurting her feelings. "Sure," he said, and held it out. "Careful, the point is sharpened." She reached out and took it in her hand, gently running her fingers over it and touching the point softly. "It's rough," she said, as she ran her fingers back over the curve of the hook. "Yeah, it's a pretty crude piece of work. We didn't really have a lot of tools. Doesn't work as good as a hand, that's for sure." She looked up into his eyes. "I think it's very sexy." Luke only just managed to prevent his mouth from dropping open as he pulled his hook away and rested it on the palm of his good hand. "Thanks. Becky, look, sorry, but..." "Oh my God, I was coming on too strong. Sorry, it's the beer. It went straight to my head." "No, it's okay, really. I'm very flattered, but..." "You have a girl," she said, looking at the ground. Luke felt a knife twist in his chest. "Yeah," he said, tears stinging his eyes. "You're really nice, though." She laughed and shook her head ruefully. "You too," she said, thankfully still looking at the grass under her feet. "Are you going to stay?" "No, I'm just here for the night, but I'm sure I'll be back sometime. Can I drop by and say hello?" "Well, sure," she said, although her tone said she didn't quite believe him. "So where are you from?" he asked. The awkwardness passed as they talked. It turns out Becky had been in the Drake Mountain facility too, one of the first kids taken in, along with her brother. He had been killed during the firefight between Randall's men and the Homeland Security people. Neither of them remembered the other, which was unsurprising given that close to 6 years had passed, and Luke had only been there briefly. Becky was originally from Boston and had fled with her brother and 2 of his friends. They had also heard of the haven in the White Mountains and had been picked up by a patrol of Randall's men just south of Lincoln. Luke told her his story, too, about the escape from the facility and finding the farm, but didn't elaborate any further than telling her they'd had to leave and find somewhere new. "The farm sounds wonderful. You were lucky to find it. This place is great now, but it was pretty rough at the beginning." "Yeah, it's fantastic." Luke had sobered up considerably now. He put his hand on her arm. "Well, thanks for the dancing and the great conversation. But I have to get going early tomorrow. I might head to bed." She looked at him and smiled. "Sure, me too," she said, rising to her feet. "I know he looks laid back, but my boss is a stickler for things like starting work on time." "No, Colonel Randall?" They both laughed as Luke stood too. He was barely on his feet before Becky stood on tiptoes and planted a kiss on his cheek. "Thanks for being a gentleman. Your lady is a lucky girl," she said and turned away. Luke watched her go, a strange, empty feeling inside.
Maybe I will be back sometime. Luke went back out front and spoke to the colonel for around 20 minutes. He was glad he did because the colonel, possibly a little loose-tongued because of the beer, gave him some valuable intel. Randall and his group had divided the area surrounding Concord, up to a 100-mile radius, into 4 quadrants. They were systematically going into each quadrant, town by town and house by house, bringing back anything edible or of use to their growing community. The colonel currently had his teams foraging in the western quadrant, so for now at least there wasn't much chance of Randall's group meeting Isaac's to the south.
"We've already foraged the quadrants to the east and north dry, and we only just started into the west," he explained.
Because they grew a lot of their own food now, it could be years before they began moving through the southern quadrant. It was obvious the two groups would encounter one another at some stage, so Luke decided to disclose the location of Isaac's group and the fact they'd only just avoided a battle that could have wiped them out.
"I'm not sure what happened to the rest of the Marauder army, but I assume they went back to Ashland. Isaac would know."
Randall looked slightly concerned now that he knew where Isaac and their people were.
"Manchester? I'm surprised our scouts didn't spot a movement of men that big heading south. I may have to review our processes. Thanks for sharing, Luke. In fact, I'll give them time to settle in and then head down there myself in a week or so to talk to Isaac."
Luke felt better now. He trusted the colonel completely and was confident it would be a happy meeting, which may not have been the case if there had been a surprise encounter between the two groups. He said his good nights, and Bowman led him inside and through to the sleeping quarters in the back of the big old building. The cot wasn't as comfortable as the sofa he had spent the previous few nights on, but with a full belly and the last pleasant buzz of alcohol still in his system, he fell fast asleep within seconds of his head touching the pillow. That was the first night that Brooke didn't haunt his dreams, and when the other occupants of the room began to wake up and move around, he awoke surprisingly fresh and alert.
"You have hot showers?"
he asked, when one of the soldiers came into the room wrapped in a towel, his damp hair steaming in the cool air. "Yes, sir. Right through that door." Within 2 minutes, Luke was standing under a steaming spray of water, oblivious of the naked bodies around him. He hadn't had a hot shower since Drake Mountain. They'd managed a few hot baths back at the farm, but those were a rare treat. And just like the first one back at Drake Mountain after weeks of hard traveling, it seemed about the best damn thing in the world. Bowman collected him for breakfast as he was zipping up his leather jacket. Luke saw the other man eye his fluffy, clean hair and patted it down self-consciously. That was one downside to washing his hair. He had no doubt it would soon dirty up and fade to a less glaring shade of red. "Colonel Randall thought you might like breakfast," said Bowman. "He's waiting in his quarters."
"Okay, thanks. I'm starved."
He followed Bowman through the door and up to Randall's level.
"You guys are living the dream here, Bowman."
"Thanks, yeah, it's all right. You sure you don't want to stay?"
"Nah, I need to get away from everyone and everything for a while, you know?"
"Sure," said Bowman as they reached Randall's quarters. Becky's desk was unattended. Luke somehow felt disappointed and relieved. The soldier held out his hand. "Well, I'm going on patrol now. Take care, Luke."
"You too."
They shook, and Luke rapped on the door.
"Come."
"Morning, sir."
"Good morning, Luke. Made use of the showers, I see," said Randall, gesturing vaguely at his hair. Yes, sir. Now in full Ronald McDonald mode," he said, and saluted.
Randall laughed gruffly and waved to the plates on his desk.
"Sit and eat before you head on your way."
Luke's mouth started to water at the sight of the thick, roughly cut toast, butter, and honey, not to mention more instant coffee. A breakfast he wouldn't have sniffed at in the before days, but one that right then looked like manna from heaven. Luke's eyes nearly rolled into the back of his head as he took the first bite of generously buttered toast topped with honey. It really had been at least 6 years since he'd tasted toast and honey.
"We keep bees,"
said Randall, anticipating the question.
"Best you've ever tasted, right?" "You're not Sorry, you're not kidding," he said, licking his fingers unselfconsciously. Best ever.
He washed 4 slices of honey toast down with 2 mugs of black coffee, then sat back and held his belly.
I want to thank you for having me. I can't really repay your generosity, but maybe if I head back this way, I can stop and work for a while. We'd be glad to have you, son, but you're under no obligation. It was just nice to hear that you and your group thrived after Drake Mountain.
Luke felt warmth for the colonel. While his defenses had been on high alert yesterday when he'd been picked up by the patrol, having seen how things operated here in Concord, he knew they would be great allies for Isaac's group.
Thanks again for letting me know about Manchester. I know you were being cautious, and with good reason, but I'll offer anything I can to help them make a go of it. I'm sure we can be of value to each other going forward. Now, I'm not sure why you don't carry a gun, but in case you were thinking of asking, I can't give you one.
Luke held up his good hand.
No, I understand. It's okay. I kind of left in a hurry and didn't really think about supplies. But I plan to avoid trouble, so hopefully I won't need one. Okay, then.
An hour later, armed with his axe and a map provided by the colonel and his sack replaced by a backpack, Luke found his way back onto Main Street and turned onto Route 202. 9. The skip in his step when he left Concord faded after 5 miles of walking. He stopped for water and to consult his map in a bus shelter that had managed to survive the elements pretty well. He planned to follow the 393, which turned back into the 202, and follow it all the way through to Rochester near the border of Maine. He wouldn't get all the way to Rochester by nightfall, so would find somewhere to lay up along the way. In the morning, he would set out and try to reach a little town called Alfred by sunset. He estimated it was about 3 or 4 in the afternoon when he approached to turn off the 202 to a little town called Bow Lake Village. Luke paused and took a drink of water. Bow Lake Village sounded almost too inviting to pass up.
Screw it. It's not like I'm on a schedule.
He took the turn and began walking north. He would spend the night in Bow Lake Village and then simply take the road out of town back down to join the 202 again. A nice little side trip. The narrow road north to the village, Ridge Road, was dotted with homes on each side. He imagined it was once considered tree-lined, but was now so overgrown that in some places the road had almost disappeared. The further north he walked, the more spaced out the homes became, allowing the overgrowth to close in on the road and put it entirely in shadow. It felt a little creepy, like the road in Sleepy Hollow, and he began to wonder if he should have avoided the stopover after all. 25 minutes later, in the last light of day, he reached Bow Lake Village. It was quiet, and in the fast-fading dusk, no less creepy than the road in had been.
So, what does one do in Bow Lake Village? Luke asked aloud. Why, go and look at the lake, of course.
He made his way past the quaint, whitewashed buildings in the small town center and headed down to the lake. Luke imagined at this time of year it would be quite beautiful in full daylight. He walked out onto a rickety wooden pier. There was mist upon the lake, and the opposite shoreline was painted with autumn gold and rust-colored leaves.
Beautiful. Not bad, Bow Lake.
He took off his backpack and sat down on the end of the pier, fishing out the last beef and tomato sandwich packed for him by Randall's people, and began chewing happily. Brooke would have loved this spot. It was the first time he had been able to think about her without being overwhelmed by grief. After washing down his sandwich with a few mouthfuls of water from the Army-issue canteen, another gift from Concord, he headed back up the hill, feeling almost content.
Time to find some lodgings for the night.
It was almost full dark now, and while he had forgotten the eeriness of the little village when he was eating his sandwich by the lake, it returned quickly. The dark, empty windows and the wind whistling through the pine needles put him on edge. He decided he would stop and stay at the first house he came to. He turned left from the main road and then turned down 3rd Street. It ran parallel to Main Street. On the right-hand side of 3rd Street was a row of houses. He checked out the first one. It was a white timber double-story with flaky paint. A wrought iron gate hung askew on the low fence that ran along the front of the lot. Moth-eaten curtains hung in the windows. He thought anyone could be watching him from the darkened windows and he'd be oblivious. He shivered and passed it by. The next house looked just as haunted, but the third was okay. He pushed open the stubborn gate and winced at the terrible screech the rusted hinges made. Well, if there is anyone here and they didn't know I was in town, they do now. He had barely placed a foot on the path when he heard the soft crying of a child behind him. Startled, he swung around and scanned the buildings across the road. They were the rears of the storefronts he had just passed on the main road. He couldn't see anyone, but the child's crying was unmistakable. "Hello?" he called. There was no response, but the soft crying continued. Concern chased away any sense of disquiet he had, and Luke headed back through the gate and onto the road, pausing in the middle to cock his head. The crying was louder now, and he knew it was coming from a small alleyway that led between the two buildings directly in front of him. He took a deep breath and pulled himself up to his full height and strode across the road, hoping he appeared more confident than he felt as he headed for the shadowy alleyway. By the thin light of the quarter moon, he could see a few feet ahead. The alley looked pretty much like any alley you would see behind a main street. There was scattered trash, an old chair, and a big dumpster. That's where the crying was coming from. Behind the dumpster. "Hello?" Luke called again. The crying paused briefly, then continued. Luke looked up and down the street before taking a few tentative steps into the alley. "Hey, kid, are you okay? Why don't you come out where I can see you?" The soft crying continued. Luke shook his head. Nothing for it. He began to walk towards the dumpster. It wasn't until he heard a grunt of exertion behind him that he realized he wasn't alone with the crying kid. His head exploded in bright agony. Luke spun around, but his world was tilting, his legs suddenly made of jelly. On his way down the express elevator to unconsciousness, he caught a brief glimpse of unkempt hair, filthy faces, and wild eyes.